New ideas in slurry transport. Is it tame, lame, or insane? And by the name of the session itself, we have kind of started guessing who it can be. So, presenting none other than Kelly Snyder. Can we please have Kelly on the stage right now with a huge round of applause?
All right, I think they're loading up my presentation. So, Raj is a super chill guy. And I think I might lose this argument about whether we do this next year. I feel like it should be every 2 years to build a little anticipation. But if we do this next year, there are going to be a few changes. And at the very minimum, we're going to start on time. All right? Just a warning about that. I understand everybody's excited and we're all friends here. But we're at least going to start on time. Okay, so yesterday I gave a presentation about all the stuff I feel really has to be changed in our designs, or at least towards the end we talked about a few things we need to continue to think about. Today we're just going to talk about some fun stuff. I'm not going to insist that you add any of this to your slurry pipeline. They're mostly just add-ons, kind of, they're like dessert. So we're going to start with the simple stuff that if you ask for it and you're game, then we can just kind of add it to the design and it doesn't really hurt anything, doesn't require much thought, and let's do it. So the first one gets back to something I spent a lot of time talking about, and everybody loved it when I said behave yourself. The problem is my pipelines cannot handle any particles over 1 millimeter. And a lot of these classification systems use cyclones, which obviously there are alternatives to cyclones that we had a presentation about yesterday. But the problem is if you put 1 millimeter particles into my pipeline, it's going to have problems. What we used to do on these cyclone classified systems is we would just put a screen at the top of the tank. And that would collect any material over 1 millimeter. And it was not much material, and so it didn't need to be a huge screen. And we could get it through there without adding a bunch of flush water either, because it's just a 1 millimeter screen. It's fairly large. The disadvantage of doing this is that you are diluting your slurry a little bit. And it really would be better if you guys took care of this problem in your beneficiation plant, rather than it being on me. But I'm certainly happy to do this. It's not that much more work than putting in the splitter box that we already put in. We would just use the well underneath the filter as the splitter box. So we should talk about this if you aren't super confident that you've gotten all your tramp oversize out of the slurry mix. So here's idea number 2. I talked yesterday about how test loops were silly and useless. But I can get all of the same functionality, all of the stuff that's good about test loops, which isn't a whole lot, but it's a little bit. If you had the test loop online all the time, you would know a lot about your slurry, even before it went to the lab, because you could measure it through the friction loss. And if you had a questionable slurry, you could measure it and decide whether you really wanted to fill your entire pipeline up with that. I can get all the same benefits if you can just put a pressure monitoring station about 1 kilometer away from your pump station, or 2 kilometers, or 1.5 kilometers, whatever. But close enough that there hasn't been a lot of changes in elevation, a lot of changes in wall thickness. Basically, what we don't want is a large density change, a large concentration change. If we... Oh, the timer's only up there. Anyway, you'd think it would be down here where I could see it all the time. Okay, but that's the point, is if we can get that, it's essentially the same as a test loop. You're going to have a continuous idea, and you're going to have an exact friction loss continuously. throughout the entire operation. One of the challenges I often have with operating pipelines is I go there and I say, okay, you've been operating for 15 years. Where's all your operating data? And they give me the operating data, and there are all these water batches everywhere. And so when I try to figure out the friction loss, I have to figure out the density, and I have to manually go in and try to figure out where the density changes are, because all I have is pressure, and what I need is head. Let's not get into all those technicalities. But the point is, I understand that land acquisition is extremely difficult here in India. We could potentially put this in the pipeline right-of-way, in a vault, and if it's only a kilometer, we can run power and telecom out to that along the pipeline route. We don't necessarily have to have solar panels or any kind of structure above ground. And this would give us tremendous understanding of what's going on in the pipeline. And if you see a problem and you say, oh my goodness, that's going to plug my pipeline, I'm pretty sure if we switch to water or solve the problem, you're going to have enough pump capacity to push a 1 kilometer slug out the end of the line. So I've wanted to do this for a long time, but I get a lot of pushback because people say, wow, we can't possibly get the rights to the land out there. And fair enough, that's not exactly my department, so if we can't do it, we can't do it. But that's why this is in today's presentation rather than yesterday's presentation. And then this one, they have instruments that will measure the wall thickness of your pipeline continuously. But it sounds sort of ridiculous, right? Because it takes forever for the wall thickness of your pipeline to change. It's extremely gradual. But at the same time, it's very inconvenient to go out there and measure it. So at best, I get a measurement once a year, and even that's rare. And then a lot of the times, people will use a different instrument each year, and so it's not even really calibrated. So it's very difficult to figure out what the metal loss rate is. These things aren't that expensive. I would propose we could put one at a pressure monitoring station or some other place where we already have SCADA connection, where we already probably have a little bit of power. And yeah, it's a little bit overkill, but I'm going to see every change in wall thickness over time. And 10 years later, we can come back and we can look at it and we could say, oh, we know exactly the metal loss rate. So these things aren't that expensive. I think they're actually installing these in a couple of pipelines that currently have problems. But again, I haven't seen them on anyone's P&IDs, so just something to think about. All right. Now we're moving on to the intermediate things that we can do. These require a little bit more engineering and a little bit more thought. They're not quite something I can just add to the system without talking to anybody. But if we want to do this, these are entirely doable. These are not going to be all that challenging or have unexpected consequences. So we can put your stations underground. Here's a good example. This is a pressure monitoring station. Actually, I used the picture of what's in that vault a couple slides back. There's nothing here. There's a little guard shack, I think because we have some solar panels. This little container building here is the solar panels and some batteries, I think, and the SCADA connections. There's not much there, but we could have put that in a vault as well. But then we'd have to worry a little bit more about dewatering. And essentially, it's just a hole in the ground. And this is easily done. So one of the problems with a lot of our stations that aren't the pump station or the terminal station is that they're out in the middle of nowhere and they attract vandalism and things like that. But if this is all we're putting in there, I think you're going to have a lot less trouble with that. And in truth, even if you have a very narrow right-of-way, a lot of this, if it's buried, could be right there, pretty much in the same right-of-way, with hardly any footprint at all. And also, it doesn't have to be like this, especially if we could bring in power from somewhere. The main complication is that we have to generate power or have batteries or things like that. But if we could get away from that and bring in a power line, You could basically put this in a locked concrete box that nobody's going to get into. Anyway, we rarely do this, but it is an idea, something to think about when we're talking about these pressure monitoring stations, and because a lot of the pressure monitoring stations are above ground in a building and a little bit exposed. Oh, these. All right. So for a very, very long time, we've used ceramic orifice plates to dissipate energy. One of the problems coming out of a mountainous area down to the ocean is that you have excess head, and often your profile is irregular, so it's fairly flat, and then there's a sudden drop, and then it's fairly flat again. And it's very difficult to balance those pressures because you have to pump to get to the high point, but then once you're to the high point, you have a huge extra pressure, a lot of extra head there, and it essentially requires much higher pressures just to get to the ocean. So we often will put in we call them choke stations. They're basically a way to dissipate the energy. And then you sometimes have the same thing at the terminal, depending on if there are any other high points along the pipeline, just to get the pressure down, essentially to keep the pipeline full so that you don't have slack flow at the high points. And I've looked at this. In fact, some of the old timers that I learned from back in what used to be PSI, they had the patent on these because the challenge was, orifice plates are extremely common, but the challenge is how do you make an orifice plate for slurry? So we use a very abrasion-resistant ceramic on these. But there are other types of chokes we could consider, especially for water, and also at the terminal there are sometimes back pressure chokes, we say. And that's because you can't apply a really small orifice unless there's a lot of downstream pressure. Otherwise you'll get cavitation and it will really damage everything in there. You have to keep enough pressure to keep the water from turning into a vapor. And so we can sometimes have 6 or 7 or more of these big orifice plates that have fairly low velocities going through them. And there are some high-strength, abrasion-resistant steels and cast irons that we could maybe consider for that. Obviously, if it's an iron, you're going to have corrosion problems, but we could talk about that. There are other ways of doing it, I think, especially for the water chokes that normally we keep dry and they're only used for emergencies, like rupture disc lines. Occasionally we have chokes on those. There are other things we could do for some of the less critical chokes. And that's something I've often thought we could look into if we needed to. And then we also have valves we could use. Again, if we aren't talking about dissipating a lot of pressure, those back pressure legs can be a huge number of chokes because they have to operate across the entire range of flows. And so you'll need 6 chokes often just to get enough pressure to really put in one of those small orifices that won't cavitate. And if you're working on water, or even if you're working on slurry, 1 or 2 chokes on slurry, I guess it would have to be a pinch valve or something along those lines. But on water, we have a lot of options where we could actually use a valve to adjust the opening to the flow rate. So you could make a much more compact arrangement doing that. Again, these usually aren't areas where people really worry about the amount of money, but there is a large footprint associated with these. So there's a lot of things we could try. And then, I don't have a great picture of these, but again, these are ideas that nobody's really done. You can use multi-openings to get a lot more dissipation through a choke with less cavitation risk. Now, you obviously wouldn't use something that small unless it were water. And actually, we are using something a little bit like this for our pressure relief system on the PD pumps now. We're using a few openings because it allows us to dissipate the energy with just a single choke rather than having multiple chokes, because there's less tendency for it to cavitate because it has a more even jet at the other side. Anyway, that's a lot of technical information. But for water or for very occasional use, we can get away with multi-port openings. And I think if on some of these large lines, we could potentially build a choke that had multiple ceramic orifices in it if we had a big enough plate that had enough structural strength. Anyway, I guess most people don't care that much about this, but it fascinates me. So I figured I'd take a few minutes to talk about it. Okay, so these, oh, I have plenty of time. All right, so these are the ideas that, if we decide to do them, are going to be a little bit tricky. And I don't think anybody's really gone this way, and we need to think them through because there are always unintended consequences for everything. So one of the problems we have is that we build these giant tanks, and for the giant tanks, we obviously have to have an overflow because it's going to overflow either way, so we might as well have an overflow that's contained. And then where does that go? I mean, it has to go somewhere, and you have the same problem with all of your sumps at the bottom of the structure. So, I mean, I guess we could just have the overflows drain to the pad here, and then we can collect it in a sump, but where do you pump it? I've seen people design these, and I'm not kidding. All their overflows go to the drainage channel on their station pad to a sump, and then the sump just pumps back up here to the feed box. And I say, that's probably not a great solution. But anyway, this is how we end up getting these big dump ponds and huge sumps and all these other problems here that I don't really love. So hear me out on this. What if we just build a shorter tank here and dump into the tank? And then we'll build agitators in there so that you can just leave the agitator off until you've got a certain level. This obviously would be a different type of agitator than these full suspension agitators. You get some material in there, you let it settle, gets up to a certain level, maybe you add some water, you turn your agitator on, you get a nice slurry, and then you, in a controlled way, can pump it wherever you want, probably back up to the feed box. I mean, that could work, right? Anyway, these are the things I think about. But I've never heard of anyone doing that. And then all your sumps can also pump to that same tank. And this saves you from having some dump pond that's a kilometer away that you then need to add new pumps to get back to, and all kinds of other problems. Right? Anyway. All right. So the other thing is the oil and gas industry is heavily regulated because when they spill something, it causes this giant problem. But believe it or not, even though iron ore is a fairly benign slurry, it in huge volumes also creates a bit of a problem. I remember I was in Chile, and I think it was an 8-inch pipeline maybe, and it had a leak, and it flooded the entire fishing village, and it was... Anyway, I guess it was better than having a giant oil spill. The problem here is that we have a way of shutting down our pipeline when everything's intact. We generally have a pump station, usually a valve station, and then we have a terminal station. But our valve stations are often pretty elaborate with multiple valves and some instrumentation, and they get to be a fairly sizable structure out there, and nobody wants to build a whole bunch of these. But if we wanted to put in just emergency shutoff valves into the pipeline and work out how to sequence the shutdowns and all of that, all we really need is something like this. It would be one full port valve to let the pig get through, and then a couple of valves here, and then a couple of rupture discs. And that's it. And you could easily, obviously it would be tipped on its side, but you could easily put something like this underground. And we potentially could do it without much power going to it or no power at all. We'd have to figure that out. You'd have to figure out how you actuate that valve and how you handle the the SCADA going to it, but this could be a very minimal arrangement. And it is possible, but we have to really think through it, and you have to, I guess, make a decision that you're going to go this way. I'm pretty sure that there aren't any slurry lines that have this. But if you ever have a problem, it's really nice to be able to just isolate the line. And they often will put these near major river crossings and things like that. So if you do get a leak, you can shut it off like that rather than taking another 12 hours or 24 hours to get all the flow to come out and then trying to contain that and makeshift ponds on land you don't own, things like that. So this is another thing that's technically possible. I don't think it's ever been done. I can design it if you want. It has some consequences to how we size the pipe diameters and a few other things about transient analysis that would be a little bit of extra work. But if this is something you want, we can look at it. And I think what's the saying? Something like, you'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Anyway, I guess I'll be one of the guys that finishes early. Those were just some of the ideas I wanted to go over, some of the things it would be kind of fun to add some of these to the designs and maybe come up with something cool. All right. Who's next?